Hello, welcome back to Spoken D with Dr. Walt Duffy and Matt Duffy. And look, Matt, we even have a logo little poster up there today.
Every episode a little bit more professional.
Yeah.
You gotta come on the journey with us as we figure this out.
That's sort of the fun part for us, is just sort of learning how to do this and hopefully getting a little bit better at it. But we thought today, I think you had a topic in mind. Folks, we don't really have a planned out series of topics. We just sort of come into the room and sort of talk and decide what we're going to do, so that it's just sort of really fresh. So that's how we plan to do the podcast.
Yeah, so we have our suggested list, and we know we're getting in closer to, well, depending on when this comes out, right now, holiday season, and buying gifts, and popular gifts every year, requests for gifts or video games. And we know that's also a contested topic no matter what age you are. So maybe that was one we could get into today around the various potential issues or perceived issues with video games, and how to handle those if there is an issue, and or just a perceived issue, and where you go from that.
Yeah, and you talk about Christmas wishes, and I forgot. I'm supposed to, at the start of these podcasts, ask you to click like or subscribe, and so we get some more listeners out there. So we're trying to get more listener requests into us, so we have more topics to talk about. But, the thing about video games has quite the history, right? Mm-hmm. It was for a while there that, they definitely cause problems.
Yep.
And then I think you were just mentioning some of the newer research says there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation as an overall population to playing certain types of video games and having negative outcomes, whether it's personality, behavior, things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just decided to Google 30 seconds before we hopped on and found a Harvard study, and high points that were popping out was, early research was what they were finding wasn't necessarily direct causation, but they were pulling in some other things. Violent aggression in children statistically has gone down since the mid-2000s, when that's kind of the height of video games are climbing since the mid-2000s, so those are in conflict with each other. And the research they've run since then hasn't really found that what the video game is, how much violence is in it, they're not seeing that have impact, changing the way a child would be aggressive otherwise.
Now, again, you're talking about the overall population.
Right. With anything, you can always get into, well, this one person had this one effect from that. But then, then in research, you always get into the question of, well, was that the trigger? Would there have been another trigger? Is that the only trigger that exists to have that happen?
Right. And I love research. So I myself participate in a lot of research, clinical studies, running clinical studies, phase 1 through 4. But when I'm in the office with a patient and their family, and I am a child psychiatrist and an adult psychiatrist, I take things into account, such as studies, what they show, but there are also the individual factors of the person in front of you and the family in front of you, whether it's a child or an adult. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to take those into context. Too often we say, well, this is what the research showed. Well, where was the research from? Are you pulling from one study? Was a study looking at multiple other studies? Mm-hmm. Were they all done the same way? Yeah. So you have to take all those things in context. And then you have to take, so you have a person who's shy, introverted, and they're having trouble connecting with people. Video games might be an excellent way to get them at least talking with some folks online, because we know with video games there's a lot of things you can do up in the cloud and connect with other people, play to do those. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, if they're holed up in their room the entire day, whether it's a kid or an adult, and that's all they do, and that's the only way they'll learn to interact with other people, that can be an issue.
Yeah, so there's not a perfect answer on is it good or bad, right? But maybe we can get into a few of the the specifics and give our thoughts, because the first one for people tends to be the violence, and is it going to cause whoever's playing it to be more aggressive than they would otherwise. So, from what I've seen, my experience with video games growing up with them, friends, schools, all that, I don't think there's a big causation of if you play video games, you're automatically going to be more aggressive.
Which are we talking about? Certain types of video games, or just video games across all genres and degrees of violence?
Everything. Of course, people are going to be more concerned with if the video game's violent, is that a causation of violence? So we can focus directly on those, but just video games as a genre, including the war games, the Call of Duties, the Fortnites, the kill someone in the video games. I don't see people who play those being any more violent than people who don't interact with them.
Yeah, so the folks that your friends, acquaintances, people know, you have not seen that correlation.
Yeah, and I think just looking at general society, I wouldn't say that I've seen a huge shift in society becoming more violent than it was in the 80s before. Now, I'm not a big researcher, right? I don't go compare year by year violent crimes and things.
Right.
But, my knowledge base, I wouldn't say that there's been a big shift that can be directed at video games coming online.
I think the very interesting thing you brought up, because I think this is very prevalent in our society, and something that's, when we start quoting whether statistics or you start looking at any topic, is putting it into it's either good or it's bad.
Yep, people like to.
And that, yeah. So you have to be in one or the other bucket, and so you're going to have disagreement, right, among people. So it's not like we have some disagreement in the middle. We're either disagreeing about whether it's good or it's bad.
Well, yeah, because if you talk video games, right, buying it for your kid, it's usually not it's, are we buying this video game for our child? And one parent's, you're either both saying yes, but if there's an argument, it's because one's in the no boat and one's in the yes boat. Not, well, maybe it's okay for the kid, right? The argument comes when it's one person wants it one way and one person wants it another.
And so is there a conversation around that usually of, let's talk about our specific child, not our children, our specific child, how it might impact our specific child and what their own makeup is. What are we dealing with in their current life? Are we dealing with some aggression at home and their, defiance and those things? And you, Papa, are saying, let's bring in this violent game. You might see where the other person might have a little bit of difficulty with that. We're having problems already.
Yep.
And now you're saying it's okay to bring other types of violence into the home.
Well, now you're going to the singular level, right? Because in that situation, you're not saying, oh, our child's perfectly behaved, but bringing in a video game will cause them to not be perfectly behaved, right? We're saying there's already a problem in existence. Is this going to cause that problem to get worse or not be able to be made progress on?
But why it's really important, I think, is you'll read self-help columns or various behavioral columns coming from some, noted person talking about behaviors and whether certain things are good to have or bad to have, but they don't really touch on, are we talking about somebody who really doesn't have any issues, just, the normal child. I hate to use that word because I tell my patients, what is normal, right? But not really having any issues, just the sort of the typical things versus you're really dealing with somebody who has some really depression, anger issues or something like that. And so I think it is important to take into account when you are talking to folks, especially on something like this, that, hey, clarify, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a norm? The population as usual, or are we talking about specific folks? But I think it's important to keep both things in mind.
Yeah. So I'm going to push you a little bit on this one. So parents are in the store, right?
Tickle the bear, folks.
Right?
Tickle the bear.
Gotta tickle. Debating video games. From your experience as a child psychiatrist, would you say that as a standard, violent video games need to be you need to be concerned just because they're violent? So take the, kid well behaved, not well behaved. Is just the video game being violent going to have a likelihood to cause problems that may not currently exist?
So the more specific question is, for me would be, do I specifically ask within every session what video games is your child playing at this time? Or even adults, what video games are in your cabinet or online that you're subscribed to? And that's not just the typical thing I ask all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that answers your question. So I do not go in with a preconceived idea that, oh man, if I can find out that they're playing video games, I have my answer. Rip out the video games and problem solved. I do not go in with that in one of my quick tricks to deliver.
So it's so you're not bought into the old. Well, I won't say old, but original.
Well, you can say old. That's all right.
The original thought process that video games are a direct cause of causing more violence in the people who play them.
I think what's really just various things are interesting to me as we sort of go along. Let's talk just the video games. The original research was probably done by people who are even a little older, might not had much exposure to video games.
Yeah, because the people who are old enough to do the research weren't around when video games were a thing.
So,
Pong or whatever the ball that goes back and forth.
That's
was a video game.
That's what I had access to. Oh, and Pac-Man. Pac-Man and Pong. That was about it.
Minesweeper, maybe.
Maybe at the arcade at the bowling alley. Maybe.
Oh yeah, it had to be arcade games, not a.
No, Pong. Games. You could get. We played. But Pong was first at the arcade at the small town bowling alley. Yeah, and the Pac-Man. Yeah, you could dump a lot of. Sorry, folks, nickels into that machine.
So the first violent game that first generation may have been something like Street Fighter then. Because I have to try and think it's things that were on arcade games, not even computer or anything.
Yeah, so the thing is, I was never a big video game person. And I think even in your generation, you were not exposed to the type of video games like they have now when you were really young.
No, because
I don't remember
one of the big
those.
things now is how realistic they look, right?
Right.
But in the first video game I remember is when we lived in Louisiana, so I was, third grade?
Mm-hmm.
And my friend had a Nintendo. It was some game where you played frogs, but you were frogs with guns, and you try and shoot bugs or something.
Yep.
And so that was the violent, I never told you guys probably that I played it, but...
Is that over Steve's?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's
we
a long
probably
time
played
ago,
it
folks.
twice and decided it was too hard, and we quit playing it. Otherwise, then our first system was the Sega or Sega Genesis, I think. And I don't even remember what games we had on that. I do remember, I think my brother brought home the game where you shoot dinosaurs.
Oh.
One time from the video game rental store, and that was probably the first violent video game we had in the house. But then... No, my history with video games is I've always been more into this Maddens, the MLBs, the sports.
Right.
I've picked up the Call of Duties, or Halo was a big one, and tried them once or twice and just went, these are not entertaining to me, so I haven't gotten into them. So yeah, my personal experience with those video games is minimal because they weren't of interest to me in what I eventually got into.
Oh, you just open up a whole lot of topics there. So, what we do know, and just sort of what you described, is what things that are very positive that video games can do. When you talked about the dexterity, you guys became very frustrated with even the frog thing. I remember the Pac-Man and the Pong becoming very frustrating as it got faster and faster, because one of the reasons I think is that was never wired into my brain over the years. Moving something around like that was just very foreign. And I believe that kids now who have been playing some of those things, their dexterity is just markedly different. Their visual, spatial ability to move things, for some of them, they're able to really activate that part of their brain.
The thing that is to some degree insane to me, right? Because now video games are becoming their own sport, right?
Yes, esports.
And what separates the people who can play high-level video games is not that different from what separates people that can play high-level athletics. Their processing, whatever they have, no one else has. Because in video games, a lot of it's down to a frame. Right? You have something running 720 frames a second or whatever. They can hit the frame in that second that causes things to happen.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people in that 50 to 75%. They can play pretty well, and they can look pretty good against their group. But then you have that top 25%, and then as you get to that top 10%, I mean, you're starting to really slice.
Yeah, you're talking moments, I'm freaking milliseconds that you're responding, right? You're not responding on a second basis or even a half. It's the second the frame of the screen moves, which is faster than the human eyes can see. So they're predicting, in seconds, hey, in this amount of time I'm going to have to hit this button, but it's that quick that their connection from their brain even goes to their finger to let them know.
Right. So it's the difference between like a 1,500-meter swim and a 25-meter freestyle, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about tenths, hundreds of seconds that separate people. But that hundreds of seconds over the time course of a game can make a huge difference.
Yeah, like the 100-meter dash, right? The winner is in tenths of a second.
Yeah.
Well, if they go up against the average human being, it's not tenths of a second. So it's not that different from sport, I feel like, where no matter how much you practice, there is a certain segment of the population that has the ability to even get to that level, right? Which is a performance thing and all, but you can't. Well, that gets into maybe we'll go into this topic in the future, but probably a lot of those people are on Adderall and think because they say it's performance enhancing when you have to process on that that level, which is like then steroids in sports, right? Taking other substances, how does that help? But yeah, going back into the kids for a moment, because then we could talk adults, because there are people like the Kyler Murray story lately that's gone around with video games. But there are some positives, right? I think I won't say consensus yet, but a growing agreement is that video games are at least better than watching TV.
Yeah, it's an act. I think this is coming out whether you talk about neurocognition, memory. We know that now you can grow new neurons, the whole concept of neurogenesis. You can activate those networks. That's some the neuroplasticity. TV watching is a very passive, or we should say even streaming on your computer, Netflix. Those are very passive ways to use your brain. But when you do a video game, for the most part, you are having to activate and you're participating with what you're working
You're participating a lot of times. So the ones I've heard is you're participating, you're problem solving. A lot of times now you're group problem solving. So you're also communicating. So you have to build in this social interaction in addition to working your brain out from can I solve problems.
And to get through levels, you have to learn.
You have to
and
learn.
Remember. Yeah.
And then you're constantly pushing yourself to be better a lot of times. You have the competitive aspect in a lot of these games that especially the males, are seeking out, right? What's an outlet for my competitive expression? That could be punching someone, or it could be punching someone in a video game sometimes. So mentioning earlier, it'd be interesting if maybe violence as kids have gone down because you no longer have to physically punch them. You can get on a video game and box it out.
Well,
Literally.
I think we're going to have to wrap up this first part, but obviously we have more to talk about. We've talked about video games and that maybe they're an okay thing for the majority of folks. But you just brought up a very interesting thing, I think, to segue to for the next part of this discussion, and that is, can video games be used to do emotional processing for an individual? So thank you all for joining us, and be sure to hit like or subscribe, and we'll see you for part 2 next time.